It was a bright summer morning in a small, bustling neighborhood where life moved at its own steady rhythm. Birds chirped from the telephone wires, children rode bikes along the cracked sidewalks, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from Mrs. Wilson's bakery on the corner. Everyone in the neighborhood knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where people waved from porches and greeted you at the corner store, yet for Elijah, it often felt like the loneliest place in the world. Elijah, a 14-year-old boy with a quiet demeanor, sat on the worn-out steps of the community center. His knees were pulled up, his arms resting across them, and his eyes stared blankly at the cracked pavement below. To the people passing by, Elijah was just another kid trying to make it through the daily challenges of growing up. But today, there was something different about him. Something heavy weighed on his mind. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, the edges frayed from being folded and unfolded countless times. His fingers trembled slightly as they gripped it, and his usually soft brown eyes looked distant, clouded with worry and uncertainty. Elijah wasn't the kind of kid to draw attention to himself. He preferred blending into the background, avoiding the noisy teasing of the older boys or the endless chatter of the younger ones. But today, he couldn't shake the storm brewing in his heart. Across the street, Mr. Davis strolled out of the corner shop, his booming laugh echoing as he greeted a group of teenagers hanging by the basketball court. Mr. Davis was a tall man with a stocky build, his gray-streaked beard giving him the air of someone who'd seen and endured life's challenges. To the kids in the neighborhood, he was more than just a mentor. He was a father figure, a steady presence for anyone who needed guidance, advice, or just a safe space to be themselves. Elijah. Mr. Davis's voice rang out as he waved in his usual warm manner. His voice carried a sense of familiarity, like the comforting sound of an old song. Elijah looked up, forcing a small, polite smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes, and Mr. Davis noticed right away. He was good at reading people, especially kids like Elijah, who often carried more on their shoulders than they let on. Crossing the street, Mr. Davis approached with his usual energy, carrying a brown paper bag full of groceries. As he got closer, though, his pace slowed. He could see the boy wasn't his usual self. Elijah's face lacked the faint shy grin that often made Mr. Davis chuckle, and his body language screamed of something being deeply wrong. "You all right, kid?" Mr. Davis asked, setting the bag down beside him and easing onto the steps. The wood creaked under his weight, but he didn't seem to notice. "What's got you looking like the sky's about to fall?" Elijah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the piece of paper in his hand. He glanced at Mr. Davis, then quickly looked away. It wasn't easy for him to open up, not even to someone like Mr. Davis, who had always been there for him. I need to talk to you about something," Elijah finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Davis leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied the boy's face. "I'm listening," he said gently. Elijah's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. "It's about my dad," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost drowned out by the sound of a passing truck. Mr. Davis's expression shifted. His usual cheerful demeanor dimmed slightly, replaced with a look of concern and curiosity. "Your dad," he repeated, his voice softer now. Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. I think I found him." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. Mr. Davis didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the boy, searching his face for answers to the unspoken questions swirling in his mind. For as long as Mr. Davis had known Elijah, the boy had never talked much about his father. It wasn't a secret that Elijah's dad wasn't around, but it wasn't something people openly discussed either. In a neighborhood like theirs, absent fathers weren't uncommon, and most people learned to live with it without digging too deep. But for Elijah, it had always been a sore spot. Elijah looked down at the paper in his hands, smoothing it out over his knees. "I found this," in one of Mom's old boxes, he said, his voice shaking slightly. It's a letter. I think it's from him. Mr. Davis reached out slowly, his calloused hand hovering near the paper as if silently asking permission. Elijah hesitated before handing it over. As Mr. Davis unfolded the letter, his sharp eyes scanned the faded handwriting. The letter was brief, the words scrawled in a hurried, uneven script. It wasn't signed, but the name Marcus Holloway was written at the bottom, along with an address. Mr. Davis's eyebrows furrowed as he read it, and something flickered across his face, something Elijah couldn't quite place. This is a lot to take in, Mr. Davis said, his voice carefully measured. You're sure about this, Elijah? You're sure this is your dad? I don't know, Elijah admitted, his voice cracking slightly. But I have to find out. I've been thinking about it for weeks. What if he's still out there? What if he wants to know me? Mr. Davis sighed, leaning back against the steps. He stared out at the bustling street, the sounds of kids laughing and basketballs bouncing filling the silence between them. Finding someone who's been gone a long time, it's not always what you think it'll be, kid, he said finally. I know, Elijah said quickly, his words tumbling out as if he'd rehearsed them. I know it might not be what I'm hoping for. But I can't keep wondering, Mr. Davis. I need to know who he is. I need to know why he left. Mr. Davis didn't respond right away. He was quiet, his gaze fixed on the letter in his hands. Elijah's heart pounded as he waited, afraid of what Mr. Davis might say. Finally, the older man folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Elijah. All right, he said, his voice steady but low. If this is what you need to do, I won't stop you. But you can't do it alone, Elijah. Promise me that. No sneaking off, no making plans without talking to someone. Understand? Elijah nodded, relief washing over him like a wave. I promise, he said. Mr. Davis gave him a small, reassuring smile, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. We'll figure this out, kid, he said, clapping a hand on Elijah's shoulder. Whatever happens, you've got people who care about you. Don't forget that. Elijah nodded again, clutching the letter tightly in his hand. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, even if it was mixed with fear. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to face it alone. Mr. Davis let out a long, slow sigh, his hand still resting on Elijah's shoulder. The weight of his touch was comforting, steadying the boy's restless heart. But there was something in his mentor's eyes, something Elijah couldn't quite read. It wasn't disappointment or anger, but it wasn't the unwavering confidence Mr. Davis usually carried either. You know, Mr. Davis began, leaning back and stretching his legs out on the steps, when I was about your age, I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted, and no one could tell me otherwise. But life doesn't play by your rules, kid. It's messy, unpredictable. Elijah blinked, not sure where this was going. What do you mean? He asked, his voice cautious. Mr. Davis rubbed his beard thoughtfully. I mean that sometimes, when you go looking for answers, you might not like what you find. You've got this picture in your head, don't you? Of who your dad is, or who he could be. Elijah hesitated but eventually nodded. Yeah. I guess so. And what's he like in that picture? Mr. Davis pressed. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was serious, almost like he was preparing Elijah for something. Elijah looked down at his sneakers, scuffed and worn from too many days of walking to and from school. I don't know, he said quietly. I guess I hope he's someone who cares. Someone who didn't forget about me. Mr. Davis didn't respond right away. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint hum of life in the neighborhood, the distant laughter of kids, the hiss of a sprinkler on someone's lawn, the rumble of a passing car. Finally, Mr. Davis spoke. Elijah, let me ask you something. Do you know why I'm here? Why I spend my time at this community center, helping kids like you? Elijah frowned, caught off guard by the question. Because you care about us, he offered. Mr. Davis smiled faintly. That's part of it. But there's more to it than that. See, I grew up in a neighborhood just like this one. And I didn't have anyone like me around. No mentor, no father figure, no one to teach me right from wrong or tell me I could be more than what the world expected of me. I had to figure it out the hard way. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way, mistakes I wouldn't wish on anyone. Elijah listened intently, his fingers still gripping the letter. He'd never heard Mr. Davis talk about his past like this before. That's why I'm here, Mr. Davis continued. Because I don't want you or any of these kids to feel like you're alone. And, Elijah, I know you feel alone sometimes. I see it in your eyes. But you're not. You've got a whole community here that's got your back. Elijah nodded slowly, appreciating the words but still feeling the weight of his unanswered questions. I know, Mr. Davis. And I'm grateful for that. But, it's not the same. Mr. Davis tilted his head, studying the boy. Not the same as what? Not the same as knowing where you come from, Elijah said, his voice trembling slightly. Not the same as having a dad. I mean, I don't even know what his voice sounds like. I don't know what he looks like, or why he left, or if he even wanted me. The words spilled out of him like a flood, years of bottled-up emotions finally breaking free. His hands tightened into fists around the letter, and his chest heaved with the effort of holding back tears. I need to know, he said, his voice cracking. Even if it hurts, I need to know. Mr. Davis was quiet for a long time, letting Elijah's words hang in the air. He didn't try to interrupt or offer empty reassurances. He just let the boy speak, let him feel what he needed to feel. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. All right, Elijah. If this is something you need to do, then I'll support you. But you've got to promise me two things. Elijah wiped at his eyes, his throat tight. What things? First, Mr. Davis said, holding up a finger, you don't go rushing into this without thinking it through. We're gonna take this one step at a time, and we're gonna be smart about it. You're not just walking up to some stranger's door and saying, hey, I'm your kid. You hear me? Elijah nodded quickly. Yeah. I promise. Good. Mr. Davis held up a second finger. Second, you let me help you. You don't have to do this alone, Elijah. You've got me, and if you're willing, you've got your mom too. This isn't something you have to carry all by yourself. At the mention of his mom, Elijah's face fell. She won't help, he said bitterly. She doesn't even want me to ask about him. Every time I bring it up, she just shuts me down. Like it doesn't matter. Like I'm not supposed to care. Mr. Davis frowned, leaning back slightly. Your mom's been through a lot, Elijah. More than you probably know. Sometimes, people bury things because they're too painful to face. It doesn't mean she doesn't care about you. Elijah sighed, his shoulders slumping. He wanted to believe that, but it didn't make the ache in his chest go away. All right, Mr. Davis said, clapping his hands together. Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take a deep breath, we're gonna come up with a plan, and we're gonna take it slow. No rushing, no making decisions out of anger. Got it? Elijah nodded again, feeling a small flicker of hope amidst the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Good, Mr. Davis said with a smile, standing up and stretching. Now, how about we start with some lunch? You can't go chasing answers on an empty stomach. Elijah couldn't help but smile faintly at that, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. Mr. Davis had a way of making even the heaviest moments feel a little lighter, a little more manageable. As they walked toward the corner shop to grab sandwiches, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change. He didn't know what he would find at the end of this journey, but with Mr. Davis by his side, he felt just a little bit braver. Elijah had grown up in a home where questions about his father were like locked doors, ones he was never allowed to open. Whenever he asked, his mom's face would harden, and she'd sigh heavily, avoiding his eyes. Some things are better left alone, she'd say, her tone leaving no room for argument. But Elijah was tired of being left alone. Tired of carrying a hole in his heart that he didn't know how to fill. At school, it was worse. The other kids didn't hold back. The questions always came during moments when he least expected them. "Hey, Elijah," one boy sneered during lunch, loud enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you ever bring your dad to career day?" "Oh, wait, you don't have one." The cafeteria erupted into laughter, and Elijah just stared down at his tray, trying to ignore the heat rising in his face. His throat tightened as he gripped his fork, his knuckles turning white. Another time, during a group assignment, a girl leaned over and whispered, "Did your dad leave because of you? I mean, you must have done something, right?" Her voice dripped with fake innocence, but her words hit like daggers. It wasn't just the kids, either. The teachers weren't much better. Their pitying looks when he handed in a permission slip signed by only his mom, or the careful way they said, "Elijah, do you need extra time to work on this project," like they assumed he couldn't handle things, made him feel small. Each moment piled onto the weight Elijah already carried. He didn't need anyone's pity. What he needed, what he craved, was the truth. At least he had Mr. Davis. The local mentor wasn't just someone who volunteered at the community center. To Elijah, he was a lifeline. When his mom was working double shifts at the diner, it was Mr. Davis who filled the gap. He taught Elijah how to tie a tie for his 8th grade graduation, showed him how to dribble a basketball without looking down, and told him, "You've got to face the world, son. No one else is gonna do it for you." But even with all Mr. Davis's guidance, Elijah couldn't shake the need to know where he came from. It wasn't about replacing Mr. Davis, it was about finding the missing piece of himself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elijah sat on his bed, staring at the folded piece of paper in his hands. He had found it weeks ago, hidden in an old box in the back of his mom's closet. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was. The paper was yellowed and brittle, with faint creases where it had been folded and unfolded countless times. But then he saw the name, Marcus Holloway. And beneath it, an address in a part of town Elijah had never been to. His heart had raced as he stared at the letter, the words blurring together as questions flooded his mind. Was this him? Was this his dad? And if it was, why had his mom hidden it? The next day, Elijah found himself sitting on the steps of the community center, clutching the letter like it was a lifeline. Mr. Davis approached him, his usual booming laughter quieted as he noticed the troubled look on Elijah's face. "Elijah," Mr. Davis called, easing himself down onto the step beside him. "What's on your mind, kid?" Elijah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the letter. Finally, he looked up, his eyes full of uncertainty. "I need to talk to you about something. It's about my dad." Mr. Davis's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something Elijah couldn't quite place. "Your dad, huh?" Mr. Davis said, leaning back slightly. "All right. I'm listening." Elijah hesitated again, then unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "I don't know if it's him for sure," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I found this. It's an old letter. It has his name. And an address. Mr. Davis's smile faded as his eyes fell on the paper. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. What's the name? He asked finally, his voice calm but laced with something Elijah couldn't quite identify. Elijah swallowed hard. Marcus Holloway. Mr. Davis froze. His usually warm, expressive face became unreadable, his eyes darkening like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. You sure about this? Mr. Davis asked, his tone measured. Elijah nodded. It's all I have. I need to know if he's my dad. Mr. Davis didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and staring out at the street. Elijah, he said finally, his voice low, this is a big deal. You've got to be ready for what you might find. You might not get the answers you're hoping for. I know, Elijah said quickly. But I have to try. I've spent my whole life not knowing anything about him. I'm tired of wondering. That night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Mr. Davis's words echoed in his mind. You might not get the answers you're hoping for. He wanted to believe his father was someone who cared, someone who had a good reason for not being in his life. But what if that wasn't true? What if his father didn't want to see him? What if he found him, only to realize he'd been better off not knowing? The doubts clawed at him, but they couldn't overpower the yearning in his heart. He needed to find Marcus Holloway, no matter what it took. The next day at school, Elijah sat quietly in the back of the classroom, his mind far away from the math problems on the board. His classmates whispered and laughed around him, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. When the bell rang, Elijah grabbed his backpack and headed for the door, only to be stopped by one of the boys who always seemed to take pleasure in tormenting him. Hey, Elijah, the boy said with a smirk. Still no dad for Father-Son Day next week. Maybe you can borrow Mr. Davis. Oh wait, you don't even have a real dad to borrow him for. The words cut deep, but Elijah didn't respond. He pushed past the boy and headed for the exit, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Later that evening, Elijah met Mr. Davis at the community center. He handed him the letter, his hands trembling slightly. I need your help, he said, his voice steady but quiet. Mr. Davis studied the letter for a long moment, then looked up at Elijah. All right, he said finally. We'll do this together. But you've got to promise me something. What? Elijah asked. You've got to be ready for anything, Mr. Davis said. The truth isn't always what we want it to be. But it's better than living in the dark. Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. I'm ready, he said. Mr. Davis gave him a small, reassuring smile. Then let's find out the truth. That weekend, Elijah sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment, the letter in front of him. His mom moved around the room, busy with the never-ending tasks that came from working double shifts and keeping their small home together. He had rehearsed the words 100 times in his mind, but none of them felt right. Finally, he took a deep breath. Mom, can I ask you something? She didn't stop moving, just nodded absent-mindedly. Sure, baby. What is it? It's about my dad. The dish towel in her hand froze mid-wipe. Slowly, she turned to look at him, her face guarded. Elijah, we've talked about this before. No, he said, his voice firmer than he expected. We haven't. You've always said it's better not to talk about it. But I can't do that anymore. I need to know. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Elijah thought she might finally tell him something, anything. But then she shook her head. Elijah, some truths don't bring peace. They only bring pain. He clenched his fists under the table. But it's my pain to deal with. I found this. He slid the letter toward her. Do you know who Marcus Holloway is? Her eyes widened when she saw the name, and a mixture of anger and fear flashed across her face. She snatched the letter off the table and crumpled it in her hand. "Where did you find this?" "In your closet," he admitted, shrinking slightly under her sharp gaze. "You had no right to go through my things," she snapped, her voice trembling. "I had every right." Elijah shot back, his voice louder than he intended. "He's my dad, isn't he?" Her lips tightened into a thin line, and for a long time, she didn't answer. Finally, she exhaled, the fight seeming to leave her all at once. "Elijah, you don't understand. He's not the kind of person you want in your life." "You don't know what I want." Elijah stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You've kept me in the dark my whole life. I deserve to know who he is." Tears filled her eyes, but she held her ground. "You're my son. My job is to protect you, even if you don't understand why. And my job is to find out who I am," Elijah said, his voice breaking. "If you won't help me, then I'll figure it out myself." He grabbed the crumpled letter from her hand and stormed out of the apartment, his heart pounding. Later that evening, Elijah sat on the bleachers at the park, the crumpled letter in his pocket. The setting sun bathed the basketball court in golden light, but he didn't notice. His mind was racing, replaying the argument with his mom over and over. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Mr. Davis climbing up the bleachers, his face lined with concern. "Your mom called me," Mr. Davis said, sitting down beside him. "She's worried about you." Elijah snorted. "She's worried because I want to know the truth." "How is that fair?" Mr. Davis leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "It's not about fair, Elijah. Parents make choices to protect their kids, even if those choices don't make sense to us." "She said he's not the kind of person I'd want in my life," Elijah muttered. "But how does she know that?" "She hasn't even given me a chance to decide for myself." Mr. Davis was quiet for a moment, watching a group of kids playing on the court below. "You've got a fire in you, kid," he said finally. "That's a good thing. But this road you're on? It's not going to be easy. You might find answers you don't like. Are you ready for that?" Elijah looked down at his hands, the letter crinkling in his pocket. "I don't know. But I can't stop now. I need to know." Mr. Davis nodded slowly. "All right. Then I'll help you. But on one condition: you've got to promise me you'll keep an open mind. Whatever you find, good or bad, it doesn't define who you are." Elijah met his mentor's gaze and nodded. "I promise." The next day, Elijah and Mr. Davis set off to find Marcus Holloway. The address on the letter led to a neighborhood on the other side of town, a place Elijah had only heard about in passing. It wasn't a bad area, but it wasn't exactly welcoming, either. The houses were small and close together, their once bright paint faded from years of wear. Kids played on the sidewalks, their laughter echoing through the streets, while older folks sat on porches, watching the world go by. Elijah's stomach churned as they approached the house. It was a modest one-story home with a patchy lawn and a broken mailbox leaning to one side. "This is it," Mr. Davis said, glancing at Elijah. "You ready?" Elijah nodded, though his heart felt like it might beat out of his chest. They walked up to the door, and Elijah hesitated before knocking. His hand hovered in the air, his nerves getting the better of him. Mr. Davis placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got this, kid." Taking a deep breath, Elijah knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. A man stood there, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with tired eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of stories. "Yes," the man said, his voice deep and cautious. Elijah swallowed hard. "Are you Marcus Holloway?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Who's asking? Elijah's mouth felt dry. He glanced at Mr. Davis, who gave him an encouraging nod. I'm Elijah, he said finally. I think you might be my father. The man froze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, Marcus stepped back, opening the door wider. You'd better come in, he said quietly. Inside, the house was simple but tidy. The living room was small, with a worn couch and a coffee table covered in old magazines. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Marcus gestured for them to sit, then took a seat across from them, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Why do you think I'm your father? He asked, his tone guarded. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, smoothing it out before handing it to Marcus. This, Elijah said. I found it in my mom's things. Your name's on it? Marcus took the letter, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his jaw tightened, and a muscle in his cheek twitched. When he finished, he set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. I wrote this a long time ago, he said, his voice heavy. So it's true? Elijah asked, his voice trembling. Marcus met his eyes, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something softer in his gaze. Yeah, he said quietly. It's true. I'm your father. The words hung in the air, both a confirmation and a weight that neither of them knew how to carry. The conversation that followed was awkward and halting, with long stretches of silence punctuated by tentative questions. Marcus explained that he and Elijah's mom had been together briefly when they were younger, but things hadn't worked out. He had made mistakes, big ones, and by the time he realized what he had lost, it was too late. I thought about reaching out, Marcus said, his voice filled with regret. But your mom, she made it clear I wasn't welcome in your life. And maybe she was right. I wasn't in a good place back then. Elijah listened, his emotions swirling. He wasn't sure what he had expected: an apology? An explanation? A sense of closure? Instead, he felt a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange, cautious hope. As they left the house, Mr. Davis placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. You okay? Elijah nodded slowly, his mind still processing everything. I think so. I don't know what happens next, but, at least now I know. Mr. Davis smiled. That's a good start, kid. One step at a time. Elijah nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had been alone in this search for so long that having someone, even just Mr. Davis, on his side felt like a lifeline. All right, kid, Mr. Davis said, his tone firm but kind. If we're doing this, we're doing it the right way. No sneaking around. No putting yourself in danger. Agreed. Agreed, Elijah whispered. Mr. Davis leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah's determined expression. All right. Let's start from the beginning. What do you know about Marcus Holloway? Elijah pulled out his notebook, the pages dog-eared and crammed with scribbled notes. He laid it on the table, pointing to the first entry. I found his name on that letter. It's from years ago, probably before I was even born. It's not much, but I've also found some other things. He flipped to another page where he had pasted a grainy photo of a man standing next to a motorcycle. The edges of the picture were frayed, and the ink had faded over time, but the man's face was still visible. That's him, Elijah said, his finger trembling slightly as he pointed to the photo. I found this in an old album my grandma had hidden in her closet. She didn't want me to see it, but I couldn't stop looking at it. He looks so alive. Like someone you'd notice right away. Mr. Davis picked up the photo and studied it. Yeah, he's got one of those faces, all right. Confident. Maybe a little troublemaker in his eyes. That's what I thought too, Elijah said, his voice picking up speed. But look here. He turned to another page in the notebook, where he had written down addresses and locations he had found through bits and pieces of conversation. I think he might have lived in Ridgewood for a while. There's a bar there someplace called Joe's Tavern. My grandma mentioned it once, said it was his favorite spot. Joe's Tavern, Mr. Davis repeated, tapping his chin. That place is still around. I know the owner. He's been running it for decades. If Marcus was a regular, Joe might remember him. Elijah's eyes lit up. Really? You think he'd talk to us? He might, Mr. Davis said cautiously. But let me be clear, Elijah, just because we find people who knew him doesn't mean they'll have good things to say. You have to prepare yourself for that. Elijah's excitement dimmed slightly, but he nodded. I know. I just want to understand who he was. The next day, they drove to Ridgewood. The ride was quiet, filled only with the hum of the car engine and the occasional chirp of birds outside. Elijah stared out the window, his mind racing with questions. What if Joe remembered Marcus? What if he didn't? When they arrived, Joe's Tavern stood at the corner of a narrow street, its weathered sign creaking in the breeze. The building looked like it hadn't changed in decades, with faded red bricks and peeling paint. You sure about this? Mr. Davis asked as they got out of the car. Elijah nodded. I have to be. Inside, the tavern smelled of old wood and faint cigarette smoke. A few older men sat at the bar, chatting quietly. Behind the counter stood a man with silver hair and a rugged face. Joe, Elijah assumed. Davis. Joe called out, his face breaking into a grin. Haven't seen you in years. What brings you here? Mr. Davis exchanged a quick handshake with Joe before gesturing to Elijah. We're looking for some information. Think you can help us? Joe's eyes shifted to Elijah, his expression curious. Depends on what you're looking for. Elijah stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nerves. I'm looking for someone named Marcus Holloway. I think he might be my dad. Joe's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Marcus Holloway, now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. You knew him? Joe nodded slowly. Yeah, I knew Marcus. He used to come around here a lot, back in the day. Always had a story to tell, always had that big laugh of his. But, he wasn't exactly the settling down type, if you know what I mean. Elijah swallowed hard. What do you mean? Joe hesitated, glancing at Mr. Davis before answering. Marcus was a good guy in some ways, but he had his demons. He got into trouble more times than I can count. Fights, debts, you name it. He didn't always make the best choices. Elijah felt a lump forming in his throat. Do you know where he is now? Joe shook his head. Last I heard, he was heading out west. That was years ago, though. Haven't seen or heard from him since. The disappointment hit Elijah like a wave, but he refused to give up. Do you know anyone who might know more? Someone who was close to him. Joe scratched his chin, thinking. There was a woman, Lisa, I think her name was. She and Marcus were pretty tight for a while. She used to live a few blocks from here. Might be worth checking out. Elijah's eyes lit up again. Do you know her address? Joe scribbled something on a napkin and handed it to him. I can't promise she's still there, but it's a start. Thank you, Elijah said, clutching the napkin like it was a lifeline. They found Lisa's house a few streets over. It was a small, unassuming place with a garden overgrown with wildflowers. Elijah hesitated on the porch, his nerves returning in full force. You don't have to do this if you're not ready, Mr. Davis said gently. I'm ready, Elijah said, though his shaking hands betrayed his words. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, It opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a worn smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her gaze shifting between Elijah and Mr. Davis. "My name's Elijah," he said, his voice steady. "I'm looking for Marcus Holloway. I think he might be my father." Lisa's expression softened, and she stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, Lisa offered them tea and sat across from Elijah at the kitchen table. "So you're Marcus's boy," she said, more a statement than a question. "I think so," Elijah said. "Did you know him well?" Lisa smiled faintly. "I knew Marcus better than most. He was complicated. Charming, but stubborn as a mule. He had a good heart, but he didn't always know how to show it." Elijah leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "Do you know why he left? Why he never came back?" Lisa sighed, her expression turning wistful. "Marcus was always running from his past, from his mistakes, from anything that felt too permanent. Your mom, she wanted stability. Marcus couldn't give her that. So he left, thinking it was the best thing for everyone. But I think it broke his heart more than he ever let on." Tears pricked Elijah's eyes, but he blinked them away. "Do you know where he is now?" Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Last I heard, he was in Detroit. He's got a cousin there, Darnell. They're close, so if anyone knows where Marcus is, it's him." Elijah felt a spark of hope reignite in his chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Lisa reached out and placed a hand on his. "I hope you find him, Elijah. But remember, whatever you find, it doesn't change who you are. You're more than just his son. You're your own person." Back in the car, Elijah clutched the napkin with Darnell's name and address written on it. The journey felt far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was making real progress. "What now?" he asked Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis started the car and gave Elijah a reassuring smile. "Now we head to Detroit." The road to Detroit stretched out before them like a lifeline to the answers Elijah desperately sought. Mr. Davis drove in silence, occasionally glancing at Elijah, who sat clutching the napkin with Darnell's address. His notebook rested on his lap, open to a blank page. Elijah had always been a planner. Every step of the search had been carefully thought out and documented in his notebook, yet now he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Would this lead take him to his father, or was it just another dead end? "Mr. Davis," Elijah began, his voice breaking the stillness. What if he doesn't want to see me?" Mr. Davis gripped the will a little tighter. "That's a tough question, kid. I wish I could promise you everything will work out, but I won't lie to you. Sometimes, people don't live up to our expectations. But you're doing this because you need closure, and no matter what happens, you'll come out stronger for it." Elijah nodded, staring out the window as the familiar sights of their neighborhood faded into distant memories. When they arrived in Detroit, the city was alive with movement, cars honking, people walking briskly down crowded sidewalks, street vendors shouting about their wares. Elijah looked around, feeling both nervous and hopeful. Darnell's address led them to a small, brick apartment complex on the east side of the city. The building was old but well kept, with flower pots lining some of the balconies. Elijah stood at the front door, his breath shallow as he reached for the buzzer marked Darnell H. His hand hesitated, hovering over the button. "Take your time, Elijah," Mr. Davis said gently, standing behind him. Finally, Elijah pressed the button. A crackling voice came through the intercom. "Yeah? Who's this?" Elijah cleared his throat, his voice trembling. My name's Elijah. I think you might be my uncle, or, maybe my dad's cousin. I'm looking for Marcus Holloway." There was a long pause on the other end. Elijah could hear muffled voices in the background. Finally, the voice responded, softer this time. Marcus's boy. You're Marcus's boy. Elijah blinked, surprised. You knew him. The intercom buzzed, and the lock clicked open. Come on up. Third floor, apartment 305. Darnell was waiting at the door when they reached the apartment. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and kind but weary eyes. He looked at Elijah for a long moment, as if searching for something familiar. You've got his eyes, Darnell said finally, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Elijah felt his chest tighten. He'd never heard anyone say that before. Come in, Darnell said, stepping aside to let them enter. The apartment was modest but cozy, filled with photos and knickknacks that told a story of family and history. Darnell gestured for them to sit on the couch before he pulled a chair over and sat across from them. So, Darnell began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You're looking for Marcus? Elijah nodded. I think he might be my dad. I've never met him, but I have to find out. Darnell rubbed his hands together, his expression thoughtful. Marcus and I were close growing up. He was like a brother to me. But Marcus, he's always been the kind of guy who doesn't stay in one place too long. He's got a restless spirit, you know. Elijah swallowed hard. Do you know where he is now? Darnell hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I do. He's still in Detroit, but he's keeping a low profile. He's had a rough couple of years, lost a lot of people, made some mistakes. He's not the same guy he used to be. Can you take me to him? Elijah asked, his voice filled with both hope and fear. Darnell studied him for a moment before nodding. All right. But you need to know something, kid. Marcus, he might not be what you're expecting. He's been through a lot, and he's not exactly proud of the choices he's made. Are you ready for that? Elijah clenched his fists, determination flashing in his eyes. I have to meet him, no matter what. They drove to a small mechanics shop on the outskirts of the city. The smell of oil and gasoline hung heavy in the air, and the sound of clanking tools echoed from inside the garage. That's where he works, Darnell said, pointing to the shop. He's a good mechanic, always has been. But he keeps to himself these days. Elijah's heart pounded as they walked toward the garage. Inside, a man was bent over the hood of a car, his hands covered in grease. His back was turned, but Elijah felt an odd sense of familiarity. Marcus, Darnell called out. The man straightened, turning slowly to face them. His face was lined with age and wear, his eyes shadowed by years of hardship. But when his gaze landed on Elijah, something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or disbelief. Elijah, Marcus said softly, his voice hoarse. Elijah froze, his mind racing. How did Marcus know his name? You've grown, Marcus said, stepping closer. He looked at Darnell, then back at Elijah. I knew this day would come, but I didn't think it'd be so soon. Elijah's throat tightened. You knew about me. Marcus nodded, his shoulders sagging. I knew. I just didn't know if I deserved to be part of your life. The words hit Elijah like a punch to the chest. All these years, he'd imagined his father didn't care, that he'd left without a second thought. But now, standing face to face with the man, he saw something he hadn't expected: regret. Why? Elijah asked, his voice cracking. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you try? Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair, his expression pained. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying away. Your mom, she deserved better than the mess I was back then. And you deserved a father who could give you more than I ever could. Elijah felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away. I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to know you. Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry, son. I've made a lot of mistakes, but leaving you was the biggest one." The conversation that followed was raw and emotional. Marcus told Elijah about his struggles, his battles with addiction, the mistakes that had driven him away, and the long road he'd taken to try to rebuild his life. Elijah listened intently, his emotions swinging between anger and compassion. He wanted to yell at Marcus for leaving, but he also couldn't ignore the pain in his father's voice. By the time they left the garage, Elijah felt like a weight had been lifted off his chest. He still had questions, so many questions, but for the first time, he felt like he was starting to understand. As they drove back to Darnell's apartment, Elijah turned to Mr. Davis, who had been quietly supportive through the entire journey. "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice steady. Mr. Davis smiled, his eyes warm with pride. "You're a brave kid, Elijah. Never forget that." Elijah nodded, clutching his notebook tightly. He wasn't sure what the future held for him and Marcus, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of their story. Elijah's head snapped toward Mr. Davis, the air suddenly thick with tension. "What is he talking about?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Mr. Davis opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a shadow of guilt that Elijah had never seen before. "Davis, don't just stand there," Marcus said, his voice rising with anger. "You owe him the truth." "Truth?" Elijah asked, his chest tightening. "What truth? Someone tell me what's going on." Mr. Davis sighed deeply, dragging a hand across his face. "Elijah, it's complicated." "No," Marcus cut in, his tone sharp. "It's simple. Tell him, or I will." Elijah's stomach churned as he turned back to Mr. Davis. "You've been helping me all this time. Teaching me, guiding me. Why do I feel like I'm missing something?" Mr. Davis finally met Elijah's eyes, his voice heavy with emotion. "Because I've been hiding something from you, Elijah. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The world seemed to stand still as Elijah waited, every muscle in his body tense. "I knew your father," Mr. Davis said quietly. "Marcus and we were close once. Before everything fell apart." Elijah's eyes widened. "You knew him? You knew who my dad was this whole time?" Mr. Davis nodded slowly. "I did. But there's more to it than that. I wasn't just some random mentor who happened to come into your life, Elijah. I came into your life because of him." Elijah took a shaky step back, his mind racing. "Because of him? What do you mean?" "I promised your mom I'd watch over you," Mr. Davis admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "When Marcus left, I stepped in. I wanted to make sure you had someone to look up to. You knew he left me." Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper now, his words trembling with hurt. "You knew everything, and you didn't tell me." "I thought I was doing what was best for you," Mr. Davis said desperately. "I didn't want you to grow up with the anger and resentment I knew you'd feel if you knew the truth too soon. I wanted to give you time to grow up before you confronted it." Elijah shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "So all this time, you knew who my father was, and you just let me think he was some stranger I'd never find." Marcus, who had been silent for the last few moments, finally spoke. "He's not wrong to feel betrayed, Davis. You should have told him." Mr. Davis turned to Marcus, his expression darkening. "Don't act like you have the moral high ground here, Marcus. You walked away. You left Elijah and his mom to fend for themselves. I stepped in when you wouldn't. That wasn't your choice to make." Marcus shot back, his voice filled with fury. "He's my son, not yours." "Then where were you?" Mr. Davis countered, his voice rising. "Where were you when he needed a father? Where were you when he had questions no one else could answer? You don't get to show up now and act like you care. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. Stop it, he yelled, his voice cracking. Just, stop. Both men froze, turning to look at him. I didn't come here for this, Elijah said, tears streaming down his face. I didn't come here to watch two grown men fight about who did what. I just wanted to know who my dad was. Marcus stepped closer, his voice softening. Elijah. I'm sorry. For everything. Leaving was the biggest mistake of my life, and I've regretted it every single day since. But Davis is right, I wasn't ready to be the father you needed. I was a mess, and I thought staying away would protect you. Elijah wiped his face with his sleeve, his emotions raw. You don't get to decide what's best for me. Neither of you does. I spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't enough. Why my dad didn't want me. And now I'm supposed to believe you stayed away to protect me. Marcus nodded slowly. I know it doesn't make up for what I've done. But I want to make it right, if you'll let me. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to be here now. Elijah looked at Marcus, then at Mr. Davis. His mind was spinning, his heart aching. The people he had trusted, the people he had searched for, they had all kept secrets from him. But in the middle of the chaos, one thing became clear, he had to make his own choice. I need time, Elijah said finally, his voice trembling. I can't do this right now. Mr. Davis stepped forward. Elijah, listen. No, Elijah interrupted, holding up a hand. I need time to figure this out on my own. I don't know if I can trust either of you right now. Marcus and Mr. Davis exchanged a glance, their arguments falling silent. All right, Marcus said quietly. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. That night, Elijah sat in his room, staring at the notebook he had used to piece together the puzzle of his father's identity. The answers he had worked so hard to find now felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. He thought about Mr. Davis, the man who had been there for him through thick and thin. The man who had taught him how to be strong, but who had also kept the truth from him. And he thought about Marcus, the father he had imagined in 100 different ways. The man who had finally stepped forward, but only after years of silence and regret. Elijah closed the notebook and leaned back, letting out a shaky breath. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he realized that finding his father wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning of something new, something messy, something complicated, but maybe, just maybe, something worth holding onto. As he drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered in his mind: no matter how broken the pieces were, he would find a way to put them back together. On his own terms. The days that followed were a blur for Elijah. His emotions swung wildly. One moment, he was furious at Mr. Davis for hiding the truth, and the next, he felt a deep ache for the father he barely knew. Everything he thought he understood about his life felt like it had been turned upside down. At school, Elijah's mind wandered. His classmates' laughter, the teacher's voice, it all faded into the background. He doodled in his notebook during class, his sketches reflecting the storm inside him, fragmented faces, jagged lines, and question marks that seemed to mock him. During lunch, he sat alone under the oak tree by the basketball court, replaying the encounter with Marcus over and over in his mind. The way Marcus's eyes had filled with regret haunted him. And Mr. Davis's silence. Elijah wasn't sure which was worse. When Mr. Davis called later that evening, Elijah let the phone ring. And when Marcus sent a text saying, "I'd like to talk when you're ready," Elijah stared at the screen for what felt like hours before turning his phone off completely. He wasn't ready. A week passed before Elijah worked up the courage to tell his mom about what had happened. She had been unusually quiet since the confrontation, avoiding his questions and retreating into herself. But Elijah couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. "Mom," he said one evening, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She was chopping vegetables, her movements precise and methodical, but she paused when she heard his voice. "Yes, Elijah. I found him. Marcus." The knife slipped from her hand, clattering onto the cutting board. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of shock and dread. "You found Marcus," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded. "I went to his house. With Mr. Davis." Her face paled, and she leaned against the counter for support. "Elijah, you shouldn't have done that. I told you." "You told me to leave it alone," Elijah interrupted, his voice rising. "But I couldn't. Don't you get it, Mom? I had to know." Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head. "I was trying to protect you, Elijah. Marcus, he's not who you think he is." Elijah's heart sank. "What do you mean? What aren't you telling me now?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she wiped them on a dish towel. "Marcus wasn't ready to be a father back then. He made mistakes that hurt both of us. I didn't want you to grow up thinking you weren't enough, so I kept the truth from you. But I still grew up thinking that," Elijah said, his voice breaking. "Every day, I wondered why he wasn't there. Why I wasn't good enough for him to stay. Hiding the truth didn't protect me, Mom, it just made me feel more alone." His mom covered her face with her hands, letting out a shaky sob. "I'm so sorry, Elijah. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want you to carry the burden of his choices." Elijah stood there, his anger fading into exhaustion. He wanted to be mad at her, but the pain in her eyes mirrored his own. They had both been hurt by Marcus's absence, in different ways. "I just want answers," Elijah said quietly. "I don't know if I want a relationship with him. I need to understand." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I'll help you, Elijah. Whatever you need, I'll help you." The following weekend, Elijah agreed to meet Marcus again, this time without Mr. Davis. They arranged to meet at a nearby park, a neutral space where they could talk without the weight of their first encounter hanging over them. When Elijah arrived, Marcus was already there, sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. He looked nervous, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Elijah approached slowly, his heart pounding. Marcus stood when he saw him, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming," Marcus said, his voice hesitant. Elijah nodded, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. "I have questions. A lot of them." Marcus gestured to the bench. "Let's sit." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of children playing and birds chirping filling the space between them. Finally, Elijah spoke. "Why did you leave?" Marcus let out a heavy sigh. "That's the question I knew you'd ask. And the one I've dreaded the most." Elijah waited, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "I left because I was scared," Marcus admitted, his voice raw. "I was young, reckless, and completely unprepared to be a father. Your mom deserved someone who could step up, and I wasn't that person. So I ran." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You ran? That's your excuse." "No," Marcus said quickly. "It's not an excuse. It's the truth. And it's not something I'm proud of. I hurt you and your mom in ways I can never take back. But I thought staying away would be better than being a failure in your life." Elijah's hands balled into fists. "You didn't even try. You didn't even give me a chance to know you." "I know," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "And I hate myself for it every day." The raw pain in Marcus's voice took Elijah by surprise. He had spent so long imagining his father as a heartless figure who had simply abandoned him, but sitting here now, he saw a man consumed by regret. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Elijah said after a long silence. Marcus nodded, his shoulders slumping. I don't expect you to. But I want to be here now, if you'll let me. I want to try to be the father I should have been all along. Elijah looked away, his thoughts swirling. Could he trust Marcus? Could he let him in after all this time? I don't know, Elijah admitted. I don't know if I'm ready for that. That's okay, Marcus said softly. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his room, staring at the photo he had taken from his mom's old box. It was a picture of her and Marcus, smiling and happy, long before everything fell apart. He thought about Mr. Davis, who had stepped in when Marcus couldn't. He thought about his mom, who had carried the weight of their family on her shoulders. And he thought about Marcus, the man who had left but was now trying to come back. Elijah didn't have all the answers yet. He didn't know if he could forgive Marcus or if he would ever see him as a real father. But one thing was certain, his story wasn't over. The road ahead would be complicated, filled with questions and challenges. But Elijah was ready to face it on his own terms, and with the strength he had built from all the people who had shaped his life. As he put the photo back in the box, Elijah felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the broken pieces of his family could be mended. One step at a time. The words hung in the air, thick with regret and unsaid truths. Elijah stared at Marcus, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once been his father. But what he saw wasn't the confident, distant figure he had imagined for so many years. What he saw now was a broken man, burdened by his past choices. And for the first time in his life, Elijah realized something: he didn't feel sorry for Marcus. Not yet. Maybe never. Elijah's heart raced, but it wasn't out of excitement or relief. It was out of anger, a deep, searing kind of anger that made his hands tremble. His fists clenched as he tried to find the words. His mind was flooded with memories of all the things he'd missed because Marcus wasn't there. Every Father's Day, every school event, every time someone asked, "Where's your dad?" It was always the same. Silence. You don't get to just come back and say you want to make it right, Elijah said, his voice shaking with emotion. You didn't think about me when you disappeared. You didn't think about how I was growing up, thinking there was something wrong with me. You didn't think about the pain my mom carried all these years. Marcus's face twisted in pain, but Elijah couldn't bring himself to soften. He had waited his whole life for this moment, and now that it was here, the anger was all he had. I know, Elijah. And I'm sorry. More than you'll ever understand. I know there's nothing I can do to undo the past, but I want to be here now, Marcus said, his voice low and full of remorse. But you left me. You didn't even try. Elijah's voice cracked, and the anger started to mix with something else, something much more painful. You just left. And now, I have to figure out how to forgive that. I don't even know where to start. Mr. Davis stepped forward, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a deep sadness. Elijah, I never wanted to keep this from you. I wanted to be there for you, to help you grow. But I didn't want to take the place of your father. That's why I never told you the truth. Elijah's gaze shot toward Mr. Davis, the man who had always been there for him, the one who had stepped in when Marcus ran. He had taught him how to tie his shoes, how to believe in himself, how to take responsibility. Mr. Davis had done all of this without expecting anything in return, without hesitation, even when it meant holding a secret that could shatter the life Elijah thought he knew. You're not just my mentor, are you? Elijah said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. You're my family. Mr. Davis's eyes filled with tears. I've always considered you my son, Elijah. I just didn't know how to tell you. Elijah blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. This was too much. Everything he thought he knew, his family, his life, his identity, was being stripped away and replaced with something he wasn't ready to accept. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, but one thing was clear: Mr. Davis had never abandoned him. He had always been there, even when Marcus wasn't. Elijah let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Marcus. I don't know if I want you in my life. I don't know if I'll ever be able to see you as my father." Marcus nodded solemnly, as if he had expected this response. "I understand. You don't owe me anything, Elijah. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me anything at all." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." There was a long silence between them. Elijah felt the weight of Marcus's words, but they didn't ease the pain. He wanted to forgive. He wanted to find a way to make sense of all the hurt, but it was too much, too soon. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Mr. Davis watched Elijah carefully, his heart aching for the boy who had become like a son to him. He knew this was a turning point, a moment that would change Elijah's life forever. And he knew that no matter what happened next, he would be there for him, as he always had been. "Elijah," Mr. Davis said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'm here. You're not alone in this. I'm your family, and I always will be." Elijah looked up at Mr. Davis, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. This man had been his rock, his guide, and his protector. And now, in the midst of all the confusion, he realized that Mr. Davis had given him something far more valuable than just guidance. He had given him love and stability when no one else could. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive Marcus," Elijah said, turning back to the man who had once been his father. "But I know that I'm not alone anymore. I have you, Mr. Davis." Tears welled up in Mr. Davis's eyes as he pulled Elijah into a tight hug. "You'll always have me, Elijah. I promise you that." In the days that followed, Elijah began to rebuild his understanding of who he was and who he wanted to become. He didn't have all the answers. The relationship with Marcus, his biological father, was still uncertain, but Elijah had learned something important: family wasn't just about blood. It was about who showed up, who loved you when you needed it most, and who stayed by your side through the tough times. Marcus, though still trying to find a way back into Elijah's life, had to come to terms with the fact that healing couldn't happen overnight. Elijah wasn't ready for him yet. But Marcus had made a start, and for the first time in a long time, he truly understood what it meant to be a father. As for Elijah, he knew the road ahead would be difficult. There were still a lot of unanswered questions, and his heart was still healing. But for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't defined by the absence of his father. He wasn't defined by Marcus's mistakes. He was Elijah, and he was strong, capable, and loved. And in that moment, Elijah made a promise to himself. He would continue to grow. He would face the future, one step at a time, with the knowledge that he wasn't alone, no matter what. Weeks passed, and Elijah's life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. He continued to work with Mr. Davis, who never wavered in his support. Slowly, but surely, Elijah's confidence grew. He was still figuring out how to navigate the complexities of his relationship with Marcus, but he didn't feel as burdened by it as he had before. He understood now that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed, it was a journey. And when Marcus reached out again, Elijah didn't shut him out. He wasn't ready to invite him into his life fully, but he was open to the possibility. One day, maybe, they could find a way to move forward. But for now, Elijah was at peace. The sun set on another evening, and as Elijah sat in the park, looking out at the horizon, he realized that he had already come so far. He had faced his fears, confronted the truth, and, most importantly, He had learned that family wasn't defined by who abandoned you, but by who chose to stay. With Mr. Davis by his side, Elijah was ready to face whatever came next, stronger, wiser, and more certain of who he was than ever before. Elijah's steps were slow as he walked beside Mr. Davis, the weight of the day still pressing on his shoulders. The air had grown cooler, a gentle breeze pushing through the trees, but he barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and questions that might never have clear answers. But there was one thing Elijah was certain of: family wasn't always about blood. Family wasn't about who was there in the beginning or who had walked away. It was about who stayed, who showed up when it mattered most. As they reached the end of the driveway, Elijah turned to look up at Mr. Davis. The man who had been his guide, his protector, the father he had always needed, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. He had carried Elijah through the hardest moments, filled the gaps that others had left behind, and shown him love in ways Elijah had never known he could receive. "You've always been there for me," Elijah said, his voice quiet but strong. "Thank you, Uncle Davis." Mr. Davis chuckled softly, his arm wrapping around Elijah's shoulders in a one-armed hug. "Always, kid. Always." The words were simple, but the feeling behind them was powerful. Elijah knew there was no one in the world who had his back like Mr. Davis. There was no one else who had invested so much time, love, and care into making sure Elijah knew his worth, even when Elijah couldn't see it himself. It didn't matter that Mr. Davis wasn't his biological father; he had been the father Elijah needed all along. As they continued walking, Elijah allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: peace. For the first time, he wasn't weighed down by anger or confusion. He wasn't burdened by the absence of a father or the years of unanswered questions. He wasn't carrying the heavy weight of trying to understand why things had happened the way they did. Elijah had realized that it wasn't the blood that mattered, it was the love and the choice to stay. There would always be questions, of course. There would always be moments when Elijah thought about Marcus and wondered what could have been. But Elijah had come to understand that while the past shaped him, it didn't define him. It wasn't the mistakes of others that would dictate who he became, it was his own choices, his own strength, and his ability to choose love and forgiveness. "Do you think I'll ever be able to forgive him?" Elijah asked quietly, his voice distant. Mr. Davis looked down at him, his expression thoughtful. He had spent a lifetime trying to guide Elijah, teaching him how to be strong, how to stand up for what he believed in, and how to forgive, even when it seemed impossible. Now, he had to let Elijah figure it out on his own. "Forgiveness isn't something you can force, Elijah," he said gently. "It's not about doing it for someone else. It's about doing it for you. When you're ready, you'll know." Elijah nodded, taking in Mr. Davis's words. It made sense. The anger he had felt, the confusion, it was all a part of him. But he couldn't let it control him anymore. He couldn't let the past, the mistakes of others, be what defined his future. He had to let go, not for anyone else, but for himself. "I'm not ready yet," Elijah admitted, his voice steady. "But I think I'll get there one day." Mr. Davis smiled, his eyes proud. "That's all anyone can ask for, Elijah. We don't need all the answers right now. What matters is that you're taking the first step toward your own peace." They continued walking, side by side, the quiet of the evening surrounding them. The world seemed bigger now, less confined by the walls of Elijah's past. He had no idea what the future held, but he was ready to face it. Ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he wasn't alone. The sun had nearly set, casting a soft orange glow across the sky. Elijah stopped for a moment, taking in the beauty of the evening. The world was vast, and his place in it was still unfolding. But for the first time, Elijah felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that came from within. He wasn't defined by his father's absence, nor by the mistakes of the past. He was Elijah, a young man capable of love, forgiveness, and strength. He looked up at Mr. Davis. "You know, I think I'm finally starting to understand something." Mr. Davis raised an eyebrow, a soft smile on his face. "What's that?" "That it's not about where you start," Elijah said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "It's about where you choose to go. You can't change the past, but you can decide how you move forward. You can decide who you are and what you stand for." Mr. Davis stopped walking for a moment, turning to face Elijah. The proud look in his eyes spoke volumes. "That's the most important lesson, Elijah. Life is about choice. It's about who you choose to become, even when it's hard. And I know you're going to become someone amazing." Elijah smiled, the weight in his chest lifting just a little more. "I don't know if I'll be amazing, but I know I'm going to try. And I know I'll keep learning, and keep growing. I'm not perfect, but I'm me. And that's enough." The two of them stood there for a moment, looking out at the horizon as the last rays of the sun dipped below the trees. The world felt wide open, full of possibilities, and for the first time, Elijah felt like he was ready to embrace it all. He had come a long way, from the boy who didn't understand why his father had left to the young man who had begun to understand what it meant to be family. It wasn't about the people who left, or the people who made mistakes. It was about the ones who stayed, the ones who chose to love, to show up, and to support you, no matter what. And as Elijah looked ahead, he realized that he was surrounded by those kinds of people. He had Mr. Davis, his mentor, his family, and he knew that as long as they were together, he could face anything that came his way. "Thank you, Uncle Davis," Elijah said again, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." Mr. Davis smiled, his arm resting around Elijah's shoulders once more. "You don't have to thank me, Elijah. I'm proud of you. And I always will be." And with that, Elijah took a deep breath, ready to step into the future with confidence, knowing that no matter what came his way, he had the strength to face it. The road ahead was uncertain, but with love, patience, and the lessons he had learned along the way, Elijah knew he could walk it with his head held high. Because sometimes, the people who stay are the ones who matter most. And sometimes, second chances are worth taking. Elijah didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. He knew now that the future was his to shape and he was ready to make it his own.